clarification than anything else, but we'll let them see that then everyone can, if they have some questions, we can take questions, or Aaron will take questions, or the committee. And at that point, I believe what I'd like to do and intend to do is, when we go back up, is that we take up the bill, if they voted on positively, to take up that clarification bill and then deal with that. Now, of course, that will require a rule suspension, and which I think everyone knows. And I would hope that we are able to do that so we can have a discourse on this bill and determine if this was actually what we intended when we left here weeks ago, which I believe it will be. And I think it's, from my standpoint, I think it's unfortunate that there was the comments that were made about what was the intent of the legislature, what wasn't. I believe that the committee of conference did a great job. That I think that they were clear as to their what they intended in the underlying bill, which they will be able to speak for this themselves on the floor. However, there's a thing we always worry about in any piece of legislation that goes out of here, and that is, and we all know that it's all possible that it can be involved in litigation. And litigation, unfortunately, when it involves something like this issue, will result in significant attorney's fees and cost to the taxpayers. And I don't know if you've noticed, but this last month, our revenues were not up, they were down. I don't think our taxpayers in the state can afford to have any more pressures. And that's also why I do not intend for us to be here more than today unless everybody wants to work for free. And so I'd like to be able to conclude our business today, but also be able to afford each and every one of you an opportunity to speak to this issue. So with that, is there any questions procedurally? Tim?
Is a motion to suspend the rules suitable?
Yeah, I think it is. Where's John? Is it? Okay, yeah, it should be.
Okay. I just imagine that will be a time where there will be a significant discussion. I just want to make sure that we know what we're doing.
To suspend the rules is 3/4 vote. And I believe the 29 are here, and therefore it would 22 will be needed to do that. Anything else? Peg?
John, what's the order that things have to go in? You came in here to vote on the veto, whether to sustain it or override it. And I understand there's this potentially other proposal. What comes up first? If we vote to suspend them, we don't need a rule suspension on the veto vote, right?
Actually, you do. We do.
We do?
Yes, we do. It's
Why it's been
you
warned.
have yeah, no,
Should we get John?
yeah,
down
it's
here?
it will require, according to John, it will require a suspension as well. Actually, who's heading?
Because if it's on notice,
Suspension to
You
change
still have
the
to
calendar?
Hold on. It's to take it up for immediate consideration.
consideration.
It is on notice. It is on notice now. It is not for immediate. So in other words, we have to vote to take it up for immediate consideration.
So is that what the motion would be, to take
I'm sorry.
that?
Peg, I'm sorry. Did you see it?
I am standing.
I'll stand next.
Is that what the motion would be, to take it up for immediate consideration?
Fine.
And then we have either the veto or this potential new fix or
The clarification.
whatever.
What we have is just like the.
Everybody, we can't hear in there because it's not echoed. If you're going to discuss this, do it away from
So, Peg, my understanding from talking with Secretary Bloomer is that coming here, we're still in session, we're back in session as of today, and anything can be introduced. I mean, they can actually introduce any bill they want. And then it's just a matter of just like as we do on any session, if we want to take, if I, who are in charge of the floor, if I decide we're going to go take up one issue first, which then we'll go to that, and if it needs a rule suspension, which of course both of these will, either if there is a new bill, which I believe if they voted positively for a bill, which the indication is that they did, that will need a rule suspension as well as the veto. But as I said, just to clarify, we'll make sure that John's here now, so we'll ask him on that. John, why don't you take the action seats first? John, the questions have come as far as the procedural, the propriety of whether or not the rule suspension on the veto vote itself is needed. And I said for our conversation, my understanding that because it is on notice, in order to take it off a notice, we would need a rule suspension. Am I correct?
Yes. You want more elaboration?
Yeah.
So generally speaking,
Close the door, or
I think for safety reasons, it should be.
It should be open, just
all right. Well, just as long as everybody's quiet.
I'll speak up, but like, I've never been accused of being too quiet. So the best procedure and appropriate procedure would be the one that's followed. If you were in session, it would be put on notice, it would be on there so everyone could see what the video was about, what the message was, and then you would take it up the next day. There are a couple examples where that's been done. The one that most of you are probably most familiar with, and most recently was the marriage veto. That was put on the notice calendar. The rules were suspended by then Pro Tem Shumlin to take it up off the notice calendar. That is probably your best procedure. There is a little bit of mixed history because a few times our journal does not show that when you come back for a veto session if there has been a rule suspension, but all of your calendars carry it on a notice calendar, which means there's been an implied rule suspension even if it wasn't moved. So I mean, my advice to you, in the way we've been doing it, is that the best procedure is to have it on a notice calendar, have it taken up. And I don't know of any history where a rule suspension to take up the veto was not agreed to on a veto session. So that's a longer answer. If you wanted to do something with the rules to make it clearer one way or the other, that's fine, but the best practice is to put it on the notice calendar and do a rule suspension to take it up.
okay. And so then also the clarification bill, the S-230, that also will need a rule suspension.
It will need a number of rule suspensions. There are a number of different ways of going about it. And a number of you know that in the Senate, you have a drafting deadline, which is in December. And you also, even if you were going, what's been done before, usually you have two options, to introduce a bill by a sponsor or by a committee. My preference procedurally would be to do a committee bill, and the reason is if it gets approval to be introduced, it would then, if there were any hitches, it would be on notice tomorrow. Committee bill, when it's introduced, goes on notice calendar for the next day. That's what's usually been done in the journal. We've done, you guys have done committee bills. So if you were going to introduce a remedy bill, or whatever you want to call it, what would happen is we would probably, at least to begin with, have someone move to suspend the rules, introduce a bill, and take it up for immediate consideration. That is really 2 or 3 rule suspensions. You could split them down, but either the votes are there or they're not. And historically, we'll put a couple of rule suspensions together unless someone objects. So if there was going to be a remedy bill, we would have someone move, I can script, move to suspend the rules, to introduce a bill, and take it up for immediate consideration.
Okay. And that's,
And then you would need additional, I'm sorry, you would also need more rule suspensions later on through the third, the message to the House.
John, be so presumptuous.
There is now such a bill.
Okay, yes, Bobby.
Would that new bill have to go to the Rules Committee first and then get
So-
shipped out of there to us?
You have a great question. That's why I said the original motion would include sort of 3 rule suspensions. You have an original rule that says that to be introduced or even have a drafting request complied with, you need to sort of get a rule suspension. History has allowed those drafting to occur when we're coming back for a veto, and so that's why there apparently is a bill currently. The second one would be under temporary rule 44A. We have not met crossover, so technically, if it was actually read and introduced under temporary rule 44A, which is still in effect until you adjourn finally, it would go to rules and then have to come out. When the language I gave you earlier would be that I would move to suspend the rules, to introduce a bill and take it up for immediate consideration, you would be suspending each of those with one fell swoop.
So, just so to be clear, it was my intention to do that, Robbie, it would be to introduce the bill, to move to have the rules be suspended to take it up for immediate consideration. However, I want to hear from, if anyone has a concern with that, we can discuss that now, and we can go through each individual rule suspension. I think it would be better for us to just to get to the matter at heart. But if somebody wishes to do that, I certainly want to respect that. Your right to do so. Oh, Peg, sorry.
I am still.
Sure. We're gonna give you some stills, Peg.
Would it have to, we'd have to suspend the rules, put it through second reading, third reading, or all stages of passage, send it to the House, and then the House would need to suspend the rules to put it through everything, am I right?
You are correct.
Okay.
You would probably need at least 3 rule suspensions in the Senate, and you'll need at least 3 more in the House. And then depending what the House did with the bill, if they concurred, they'd have to send it back, and it would then be passed. If they made any changes, you have to suspend the rules again to take it up pending entry into the House.
And either agree or appoint
Yeah,
conference or, and one more, you mentioned something about this being a committee bill. And since we're not in session and don't have authority to meet as a committee, with public notice, how do we do a committee bill?
You are in session. With the final resolution, the final resolution, basically, had you come back, you're in session as if it was Saturday after you adjourned. There's still bills out there, things can be done or not done. My understanding is the committee met this morning after 9:30.
And also, Peg, just so you know, it was with my authorization that the committee met. They did request, the chairman did ask for the committee to meet for the purposes of taking up this bill for consideration.
I just didn't notice that on the
Yeah.
calendar.
Dick?
Well, just clarification, technically, we're not allowed to worry about what the other body does, am I correct? Or doesn't do?
You're not allowed to use that in debate. I mean, I think a lot of people, I'm not trying to be smart, but I think a lot of people in this room try to figure out what the other body's gonna do, and so in that sense, it's sort of caring about how they're gonna react, but on the floor, we're not allowed to discuss the positions of what the other body may or may not have done in legislation, the way it may be.
Never going to care what the other body was going to do anyway.
There are 29 others.
Yes, Bob.
A lot of people are expecting us today to vote on either sustaining or overriding the veto. And I think that it's only fair that we get an opportunity, however we want to vote, to have that vote, but I don't think I've heard that mentioned, if we're going to or not going to have the opportunity to express our feelings in regards to that question.
Not only will you have the opportunity, you're going to have the opportunity, because under the state constitution, if I'm correct, that we must vote on the veto at one way or the other. What my intention to do is just to take up the S-230 first to see if we have the clarification of that. If that is, we have the clarification language, and that would, I think, afford the Senate an opportunity to decide, have a little more of an understanding of what, when they do go to vote on the veto bill, what the resolution will be, impact will be as far as whether we will have something in place or not. Dave?
You just said vote on S-230 first, so maybe it would be helpful to understand, would this be an amendment to S-230, or would it be a whole new bill? Because if you've indicated we're voting on S-230 first, then that sounds to me like it would be the veto or override or sustain vote first, as opposed to whatever number this might be, which is a new bill,
Actually,
275.
you're correct, and I don't know what the,
Right, no bill numbers yet assigned, but it will have it.
That's 260. 260?
So that would be,
yes.
you're
so
saying that
I-
would
I
be first or
missed- yeah,
230?
260 would be first.
Thank you, just to clarify.
So that's 260. So at this time, if there's no more questions for John, I'd like, oh, yeah, Kevin?
So John, I just want a clarification on what the President Pro Tem said. When a governor vetoes a bill and we've adjourned sine die, do we have to automatically come back by the Constitution?
No.
That's
So
like that.
generally, but once you're in session, you have an obligation to take it up. There is, in our files, there were 2 or 3 memos, one from Bob, one from David, and our Constitution says you shall vote. In the past, when you've adjourned sine die and bill's been vetoed, you can't come back and sine die has the whole session over. Once you're here, all the authority I have says that you're required to take it up.
So I should have been more clear on that, but yes, the fact is that once we're here, which we obviously are here, then we have to take it up.
3 questions if I can remember them. I'm sorry if I'm using my voice.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, he's losing his voice.
I'm just trying to say I'm losing my voice as a result
Can't
of
make
some meds I'm on. John, when we broke up in May, my understanding was we had targeted June 9th to come back in the event the governor had vetoed any other legislation. Is that true?
That's by a resolution, that's correct, I think it's 56 or 57, correct.
Now, if in fact we are going to consider S-260 first, as opposed to the piece of legislation that was vetoed, S-230, does that by itself require a rule suspension?
Short answer, I want to give you the correct answer. It's going to take a rule suspension to take up to 60. The order that they're done in does not take a rule suspension, if that's the question you're asking. It's no different than when we did the constitutional amendment this past year. You can move around the calendar or have it introduced. So if your question is, do you need a rule suspension to get an S-260 introduced and taken up? That answer is yes. Do you need a rule suspension to do it before you vote on the constitutional, the veto message from the governor? And that answer is no, and it's clear from the April 7th, 2009 marriage veto that kind of moved around on the calendar that day, and it was not taken up first. It was put on notice. It was taken up like 4th or 5th.
In the event we take up S-260 first, is that subject to all the normal amendment rules and processes? In other words, does that open the door for us to tinker with whatever proposal has come out of natural resources?
Yes. You're back working on a bill just like any other bill.
And finally, assuming that S-260 has some financial component in it, will it require a rule suspension to send it off to appropriations?
If the motion is, shall the rules be suspended, introduced and taken up for immediate consideration, then Rule 31 does not apply. Rule 31 is the one that goes by automatic to finance or appropriations. That only applies if the bill is on notice, and so it would not go to appropriations or finance by rule. The second part I want to make sure I complete. If someone wanted to move to put it to appropriations, that does not take a rule suspension, it takes a majority vote. You can refer any bill to a committee by a majority vote. So I want to make sure I get both sides of the appropriations. It would not go by rule, it would not need a rule suspension to not go, but it would need a majority to be sent there.
Where do you go? Let's go.
Mark?
Mr. Secretary, if the legislatures were in favor of clarifying the current bill, it's going to require a bunch of rule suspensions. I think that's your testimony to us today. my experience in past summer sessions is when the law has been changed in the summer session, once to deal with the sales tax and other times. The legislators have agreed, if they start with a rule suspension, that they're going to stick with the language that is proposed. That's what has happened. Every senator has a prerogative to offer any amendment at any time and make any motion they wish to make. But summer sessions that have done clarifications, corrected errors, or changed the law have only succeeded when the senators and the House members agreed that the language being proposed is what they will accept, and that they won't monkey about and exercise each of the prerogatives of 180 legislators. That's the challenge if we wish to clarify this bill, and if we wish to grant towns an opportunity to get started in a planning process. So to do that requires a variety of rule suspensions and a general agreement that the language that was proposed is what we're going to work with. And it is an unusual it's an unusual exercise in self-discipline. It is an incredible issue in self-discipline and trying to move a consensus forward and fulfill what the legislature believed it intended to do and what it represented to the public and to each other that it was doing. So that's the challenges we all have before us.
Doug? Hi, Justin.
So maybe this is for John, maybe it's for some of the folks in the room who have a less shallow institutional knowledge than me, which is probably everybody. Can somebody give me an example of a situation where in a one-day session there was a bill introduced, passed, both houses, foregone the committee process for the most part, foregone testimony from folks other than the folks that were in on the drafting process, a bill that was drafted basically without input of other senators, and just slid through the process in one day, signed by the governor, and gone.
I will.
And I've heard there are. I'm wondering what those examples are.
So I will give you one example. I mean, it's been done a couple
You're
times.
assuming that this is what is on 260, you're just asking in general.
Well, that's how I see the process going now.
So there are a couple of different veto sessions. Sometimes there's been a couple where they didn't address an issue. There's a couple times where they tried and they failed. The one I can give you for an example that worked real well, I was actually here for that, was in 2000. There was an alcohol for minors bill that passed both chambers. There were some things in the bill that said then Governor Dean didn't like. They maybe put in to have some fun. But he vetoed the bill. The distinction there was the Senate took it, the Senate bill. The Senate took up the bill and voted whether or not to sustain or override. The House actually introduced the replacement bill, and so there was sort of this dual working, neither side awaiting. Then Representative Costello put together a bill that was supposed to remedy it, but it also contained a few other things. And there was a rule, it basically passed the House fairly substantially. They got rule suspensions. It came over to the Senate. The Senate didn't like the additional stuff that Representative Costello and the House had put in. The Senate actually debated the bill, did a strike-all. Did a strike-all of the House bill, and then did all three rule suspensions, messaged it back to the House. The House took it up barely with another rule suspension and did pass it barely. So it's, and for your information, Senator, it worked so well that they were out within 2 hours and 45 minutes. Everybody was done by 12:45 or 12:43, and they started at 10.
So we're not going to do that.
No, you're not going to make that, I don't think. But it has been done. I can give you, there are some times where they've introduced a bill and it's only got through one chamber. And it really depends on the hitch, but there are a couple other examples.
Outside the fact that it's assuming facts, not evidence, we'll leave that for later. Go Peggy, then Tim.
John, from what I hear you saying, if we take up 260 first, we still have to, under the Constitution, take up 230 to either override or sustain, is that right?
That's my advice. I mean, if you adjourn went home, I can't call the police.
Okay.
But the best procedure, the appropriate procedure, and my advice to you is you need to vote on that.
So my question is, if by some chance 260 passed both chambers and the override was successful of 230, you've got two competing bills, and under at least statutory construction, the veto bill, S-230, would be the one to survive because it was latest in time. So why aren't we dealing with that first?
So, the two parts, I mean, I'm going to agree with the third to three-quarters of what you said. The last part, I'm not sure if I agree, just.
Well, it would depend on.
Well, so the reason I say that is I agree there's a problem. You had two competing bills.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which one would be the final bill. It might very well be the new bill because it would be signed last. It would not be a law until after it was potentially signed by the governor. So your essence, this is what I'm not sure about.
So we'd be headed into court on that, and there goes the argument.
I would
for no court. Okay.
There's an issue.
Yeah.
Tim.
This is just a quick procedural one. Can there be a motion when we go on the floor to suspend the rules, both to take up a new bill and to move S-230 to the action calendar in one motion to suspend the rules?
It's been done. You can do it. You also need to know that any one senator could ask the 5 questions. I mean, if there's an agreement that everybody wants to do them both together so they feel safe, you can do it. We carry it. It's appropriate. But it is a compound question, so any one senator could stand up and ask the question.
I want to skip back to, then we'll go to Jeanette. I want to get back to what Peggy just asked, because again, I don't, one of the purposes we're here for is to make sure we're avoiding litigation and costs to the taxpayers.
Can't hear you, John.
I said, what I wanted to do is get back to the question you raised there, because one of the major purposes we're here dealing with this is because we want to avoid cost to the taxpayers and avoid litigation. If the governor has not signed 236, he's not signed that, that is not a bill, and that's not become law, obviously. And so, what is your opinion then, or do you have an opinion as to whether we would be able to take up at S-260 first, and whether that would potentially cause a challenge of some
So
sort?
I believe your body, you can decide which one you want to take up first. I think the question I was receiving was, what happens if you both override and that becomes law and a new bill's passed? Because then there's potentially some conflict between the two. And if they're both not done, then it doesn't make any difference. The issue will become if for some reason both chambers override and both chambers pass the bill, then what?
You have two bills.
You have two bills, and some of them deal with the same sections. That creates an issue. I know that there's people who deal with it more than I do. I just know that I believe the law is it's the last one enacted that takes precedent.
I just want to be clear, John, that the fact that just because, I mean, I understand that if we override, but if it's sustained, if we pass, let's say, for argument's sake, that 260 passes, and then you sustain the governor's veto, there's no problem.
I don't believe there is, but
Jeanette?
No,
What's your-
I was trying to get your attention.
Okay, Bobby?
Yeah, but the way I look at this, some of us are getting ourselves in a box. If we don't act on 230 first, then, and then 260 comes up, are we gonna, some of us are gonna have to determine, are we gonna go home with nothing? Or are we willing to sacrifice and go home with the corrected bill? Whereas if we dealt with 230 first, if that fails, if we fail to override on that veto, then we've still got another bite at the apple of whether or not we want to go with the fix or go home with nothing. And I don't like the idea of doing 260 before we work on 230. I think we should do 230 first, and then move, if we override the veto, we go home. You know, and then we can move to 260, but,
I just want to comment one thing. I'm not sure you can decide what's appropriate, but by overriding the veto and going home, you don't guarantee that the bill's going to pass, because the House still has to also override. So if you override the governor's veto, send it to the House, in the meantime, you pass the final resolution and go home, the House sustains the veto, you end up with no bill. That's what
So, just to pick up on what Bobby's saying, I think there's a box the other way as well. If we deal with 260 second, and the override fails, and then the rule suspensions fail for 260, then we have it. So I was actually heartened to hear that John was going to do 260 first, because I think that tests the will to suspend the rules many times throughout the day. It's an extraordinary procedure to move a bill through in one day. If the will is there in the body to do that, it would be good to know that first. If it's not, then I would prefer personally to pick up the veto question, knowing that that's now the remaining way to get rid of it.
To continue that analysis, I think there are many people for whom the fate of 260 determines their vote on the override. There are people who want towns to have a say, and they don't want to take that away from the town, but they don't want to declare or to be in jeopardy of being interpreted as having declared wind to be a wind threat. And so where 260 clarifies that we're giving this power to the towns that they've asked for, but not shutting wind out. I think there are a lot of people who need to get that established first, and then, of course, you get to suspend.
Okay, with John and Dick.
I guess I would disagree with what Dick just said, because our legislative council has clearly outlined that is a non-issue, that part of it. But I agree with Bobby. I think our first thing should be the veto, because I'm not inclined to vote for the replacement until after we decide if we can override the veto. My preference is to override the veto. If we can't override the veto, I might consider the replacement, but until I know on the veto, I'm not inclined to suspend rules or vote for that replacement. Dick?
I would hope that we listen and find out what the corrections are. I mean, let's simplify this, find out what the corrections are. We have the opportunity. Maybe they're not as gigantic as everybody thinks. Maybe it's just a correction. And we move on, and it's not a battle between the governor versus a veto or not a veto. I would like to hear the corrections, and maybe we're getting upset about something that's not really that serious. Maybe some minor corrections that we all can live with. And you have the opportunity to work and vote for it and move on.
And clear, and then we'll move on to actually the talking with the
This tees a little bit off what Dick just said and what Joe brought up early on. My understanding of the way, first of all, we all received an email either late last week or early this week that had highlighted the few sentences that were meant to be clarifications of the bill as passed conference and execution period. So most of us have seen it. I mean, not everybody's been around and had a chance to do it, but my understanding is that those were the only issues that we were going to consider, that we planned to consider. And to that end, I wonder how and when and at what point we get to a place where we decide that's how we're going intent, and this is what makes the intent clear, and then we go home.
Okay, so just so you know, what I intend to do now is, we have, that memo, I actually asked Ledge Council to put together the memo that I sent out to all of you. And now what they've done is, based on the committee, natural resources, they've made the clarifications, which they're gonna go through line by line, because there's really not many, to address just those issues. And so, to get to Dick's point, exactly, this is the information that I think we'll need to make a informed decision. So, at this point, John, thank you, and we will, and Aaron, if you could step up. I'm now going to ask Aaron Adler, who's our legislative counsel drafter. Yeah. So just so you all know, is at 11 o'clock, we're going to have to go up and just ask for another recess. John Bloomer still there? Bloomer!
Can we just stay up there? Can't we just stay up there?
Can we do it there?
Yeah. You know what, if everyone's in agreement, we can do that up on the floor.
Should we just go up there now?
We'll just, before Aaron,
Just
before
go
we
up.
start, let's just go down.